So this work is part of a larger thread of work centered around algorithmic governance. That is, how do we audit and measure problematic content like disinformation, online extremism, and how do we do that on online platforms, and then specifically the search and recommendation algorithms driving these platforms. So as I was preparing for this talk, I thought of opening it up in a slightly unconventional way with this particular quote, which I'm going to read a little bit, which says, "Mankind barely noticed when the concept of massively organized information quietly emerged to become a means of social control, a weapon of war, and a roadmap for group destruction." Any guesses as to which year of the world this quote describes? Is it the world, is it our current world, 2020s, 2000s, 1900s? Some people could guess just by the word mankind in previous talk.
40s.
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. So this is actually Edwin Black's description of the world of the 1930s, 1940s, during the World War II and the invention of the punch card, which was at that time the new wave of automation and data collection. And what is most surprising is that this code is still true in today's 21st century world, and we have seen many new scholarships, and I'm sure folks here have read and are familiar with these books. Many of these outline the harms of automation and data collection. And more recently, this discussion has shifted to the harms posed by generative AI and large language models. So I'm going to read this quote a little bit more of what Edwin Black had to say in his book, which is a lot of parallels to our present-day world. So he goes on to say, the unique igniting event was the most fateful day of the last century when Adolf Hitler came to power. But for the first time in history, an anti-Semite had automation on his side. So that was what was different. And the automation was in the form of IBM punch cards. So he goes on to say that IBM was self-griped by a special immoral corporate mantra: if it can be done, it should be done. So we should take a pause and kind of reread this phrase, if it can be done, it should be done, which is parallels a very eerie resemblance to the mottos and culture practiced in modern-day technology companies. And I'm sure, being in the Silicon Valley, you all probably have seen some of this while interning at some of these companies. Move fast and break things. Done is better than perfect. What would you do if you weren't afraid? And I argue that this sort of rushed culture, this sort of culture of disruption and speed often poses a great challenges in governing these technologies and conducting thoughtful, meticulous audits. And in turn, this is what makes algorithmic governance a difficult problem. And I'll come back to these ideas later on towards the end of the talk, but let me first dive into the meat of this presentation, a couple of studies which we did in this realm of algorithmic governance. So here I want to focus on two types of algorithms, search and recommendations, and two specific platforms, YouTube and Amazon. And our focus was only one type of problem, misinformation particularly. Now, you might wonder, like, why search and recommendation algorithms, right? So now the world is moving towards large language models, why we should focus on these old technologies, right? Search and recommendations. So users generally have an unwavering trust in search engines, right? So several scholarly work, some of these cited here, have actually shown that these ranking of search results have a really dramatic effect on users' attitudes, their preferences, their behaviors. In fact, biased search rankings are so powerful, they can even shift voting preferences of undecided voters by so much so as 20%. And users don't even show awareness of that kind of manipulation happening in their search results. So this should tell you how powerful search algorithms is, and then that is why we should keep studying them despite the other new shiny technologies coming our way. For recommendation algorithms, I hope I don't have to make a case here because you see those almost everywhere, starting from what recommendations, what movies you should watch, what products one should buy, which campaign you should donate to. They are almost everywhere. And they also have these reinforcing effect, right? So the more you watch certain content, the more you share, the more you get those types of content. Now, this might be harmless, say, when you're going out this weekend and trying to buy Christmas decorations, but these things can get ugly quite quickly when, say, you are browsing for vaccine information, health information, or climate information. Now, why audit for misinformation in particular, right? So currently, there is this disproportionate focus on AI bias and fairness. And tech journalist Karen Howe captures this notion very well in her article, where she mentions how often responsible AI teams in companies are pigeonholed into targeting AI bias. Now, don't get me wrong, so bias and fairness are indeed important topics that one should pursue, but tackling just AI bias draws away attention from fixing much bigger problems of other types of harmful information, such as misinformation, extremism, conspiratorial content. So this is what is the underlying motivation behind the set of studies that we did. And with that, let's dive into this first study, the YouTube audit work. Here, a major motivation for this YouTube study was coming from these frequent headlines that I was noticing a few years ago, how YouTube is driving people in the internet's darkest corners, and then there were these opinion pieces talking about YouTube being the great radicalizer. But YouTube was also responding with articles saying that they will be reducing conspiracy theory recommendations or making it much harder to find those on the platform. But all these questions and all these reports are really anecdotal. Like, empirically, how bad is this, right? Do we really know that? And this is what a study tried to do, verify these anecdotal claims, that is, does YouTube really surface these problematic content? And in order to do this, we conducted these systematic audits on YouTube search and recommendation algorithms, and we picked one type of problematic content, conspiracy theories. Now, what really is an audit, right? I have mentioned audit a couple of times so far, but how do you audit algorithms? I'm sure some of you in the audience might be familiar with the concept of audit. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to give you a quick definition through an example, and also say that this is a thriving field of research. Lots of work has been done in this space. And this was one of the earliest examples of audits coming from the social science world. And it's also one of my favorite ones from this 2004 paper, where researchers conducted this very clever field experiment to investigate employment discrimination. That is, they audited the labor market for racial discrimination. So what they did was they responded with fictitious resumes to help-wanted ads in the Boston and Chicago newspapers. To manipulate the perception of race, what they did was they kept everything else in each of these resumes constant, only they changed the names. And the names were either very African-American sounding names, such as Lakeisha or Jamal, or a very white-sounding name, such as Emily or Greg, and hence the name of this paper. The results showed that there was significant discrimination against African-American names, while white names received 50% more callbacks for interviews compared to the African-American names, despite everything else being constant in those resumes. So this is a core idea behind audits. That is, you would keep everything else constant, and then you manipulate a single variable to determine how that change would affect the algorithm. So if you translate this into the context of YouTube, you would manipulate a variable to determine whether the search and recommendation algorithm returns different results, say when someone's age, their other demographic attributes, gender, their watch history, where they are searching from, the geolocation, if that differs, what happens with the research results. So to answer this, we set up this elaborate audit framework, which broadly looked like this, where we had programmed bots, or in other words, we were conducting these sock puppet audits. So these were bots or sock puppets, which behave like normal users, logging into YouTube, running queries on the search platform, while at the same time, a script at the back end were collecting whatever search and recommendation results the platform was returning. So we started with selecting search topics, and our goal here was to make sure that the topics are indeed high impact. That is, lots of people are searching for these topics, so they should be popular, and they should be topics which also have the potential to return false conspiracies. So we did some more background work, referring to Wikipedia, comparing with Google Trends, and we came up with this list of 5 different topics: 9/11 conspiracies, vaccine controversies, moon landing conspiracies, chemtrail, and then flat Earth. And then we audited 3 components of YouTube: the up next video, the top 5 recommendations, and also YouTube's search results. For demographics, we checked for 4 different age groups and 2 different types of gender, male and female. And to emulate this, we had to create 8 different sock puppet combination accounts. And then for geolocation, we found this hot and cold regions. That is, we call these hot and cold regions because these are the regions which have the highest or the lowest interest for that particular topic. And we found these hot and cold regions comparing with Google Trends interest over time graph. So this is how it looked like for all the topics. So for example, if you pick the flat Earth theories, Montana was a hot region or a high interest showing region, while New Jersey is a low interest or cold region. So once we had all these parameters, the demography, geolocation, and all these parameters, we essentially created bot accounts or sock puppets and programmed these accounts to keep firing queries on YouTube. For geolocation, these bots fired queries from IP addresses of these locations. Now, one very important thing that we had to do for running these audits is throughout these audit experiments, you would have to control for noise to ensure that the effect that you're observing is actually from the algorithm, is not because of the noise that might have been introduced while running the experiment. So we controlled for browser noise by selecting one single version of Firefox browser. We made sure that the YouTube searches are happening simultaneously to control for temporal effects and so on. So all of that audit run resulted in about more than 56,000 videos, capturing about 3,000 unique videos. And then was the hard part, right? The manual annotations for this data set. And I can go into detail of why we went with manual annotations and how we annotated if anyone is interested in the Q&A round. But essentially, this resulted in kind of 3 sets of annotations: promoting, neutral, and debunking. And there was a lot of thought process that went into these annotation scheme, why these 3 classes made sense for this purpose, and so on. And then we performed statistical comparison tests to essentially find out what's the result of these audits. So let's look at some of these. So what did we find? We found that for brand new accounts, demography and geolocation do not really have an effect on the amount of misinformation or the type of conspiracy theories that these platforms or YouTube is returning. This is encouraging. This is what we want the platform to do, right? So it tells us that unlike those reports which were blaming YouTube for returning conspiracy theories when it's a brand new account, turns out the demography and geolocation do not really have an effect. But once account builds a history, by watching, both demography and geolocation starts exerting an effect on the recommendation for certain combination of topics, stances, and component. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is expected, right? This is how we think the platform would behave. But turns out there are a little bit more nuanced results when we dig deeper into the actual audit outcomes. So for example, for the 9/11 topic, if the sock puppets watched YouTube videos promoting 9/11 conspiracy, you would end up getting more of these promoting videos in the recommendations. But if the topic is something different, so surprisingly for vaccine topic, the effect was completely opposite. If you watch anti-vaccine videos, YouTube ended up recommending you debunking videos in the up next and top 5 recommendations. So this, at least from these observations, it tells us that YouTube in some way is handling misinformation in a much more reactive way. It's modifying its search and recommendation algorithms selectively based on what reactions it's getting from the media and technology critics. So we know that there was a lot of pushback for vaccine-related misinformation, and it appears that they have gone and fixed that, but they have not done that universally for other problematic topics. We also found that certain demographics were prone to conspiracy video recommendations. So for example, among 8 of those demographic cases, in all but one case, men accounts, that is bot accounts who had gender set as male, were recommended more misinformative videos. And perhaps most surprisingly, what we found that in 4 of these cases, men accounts who actually ended up watching neutral videos got significantly higher misinformative video recommendations. Now, this is really problematic. It implies that the algorithm was actually recommending pro-conspiracy videos even when the user, or in this case, sock puppet, was watching neutral videos on the topic. What could this mean for real users? This means that recommending promoting videos to men who are already drawn to neutral information for that topic but have not yet developed pro-conspiracy beliefs, but now has a higher chance of developing that because the platform is returning these promoting conspiratorial videos. So wrapping up this work, the key contribution of this study was that in some sense this work developed a methodology to audit search engines for misinformation, and we were also able to statistically prove that YouTube's behavior varies across different misinformative topics. And our study also identified certain populations that could be potentially targets of certain types of misinformation. So this tells us that audit itself could be a useful way for studying how algorithms might have differential impacts on certain marginalized populations. Yes?
Quick question. So I get what you're saying about it being reactive. Like the evidence suggests that in this case, it's like being special case. Do you have a proposal as to how it might not be reactive? Like how could they be proactive? Is there something you would propose that they do instead?
Yeah, so I think one of the things they could do, and I think they are doing it now in hindsight, this is an older study, is they're sitting with like teams of experts, health experts, and also kind of looking at these health-related queries and topics in advance to figure out kind of doing these red teaming exercises. They call it red teaming. I think in the research we call it audit. So they're doing this beforehand to figure out whether the platform is returning problematic content. And so if they do more of that proactively, of course, there is some hope in kind of changing things, and we should not be catching these reactively after the fact.
Now, if that assumes that the sort of points of view are stable, right? So like we often have these scenarios where like culture changes or something goes viral, like the Tide Pods or whatever, where I don't think a red team would have come up with, oh yeah, we're going to start eating bleach or whatever.
Right.
Is there an approach there that you would advocate? Like if you were in charge of one of these teams, what would you do?
I think one of the things that I think some researchers at Stanford, maybe it was one of your students who did this work with crowd audits, right? Like where the crowd itself is reporting, like because it's not really possible for the red team to find all possible scenarios under which these sorts of problems happen. And I think that's where if you have these multiple eyes from different domains and different cultures to report those problems, and then it the company actually responds to it. The problem is if the company is not responding, or the people who are building these algorithms, if they're not responding to it. And so hopefully there should be a mechanism to do that, kind of closing that loop all the way from reporting to actually taking action. So moving on to Amazon, I think one of the things that led us to looking at Amazon is, despite being this leading e-retailer platform, how less of a focused research focus has been paid to this platform. And I think what was alarming is there were several media reports at the time coming out suggesting that Amazon's algorithm were putting health and vaccine misinformation at the top of your reading list, but there was very little research to fall back to either verify or even disprove these reports. So if you search on Amazon, unlike YouTube, which has at least tried to control for vaccine misinformation, searching on Amazon for vaccine, even this morning when I searched, I could actually find some of these books. You would end up getting several anti-vaccination products, mostly in the form of books. And the recommendation algorithm for Amazon are even much more sophisticated than YouTube. So you have your product page recommendation, which has all these many different layers, customers who bought items, sponsored products related to these items. You have your homepage recommendations, again, many different layers underneath. Pre-purchase page recommendations, which is shown to you after you add a product to the cart, that is, after the user shows an intention to buy that product. So again, this was the same question as before. How bad is this scenario? So we essentially wanted to conduct the systematic audits on Amazon search and recommendation algorithm. And here we picked only one type of problematic content, vaccine misinformation. And we conducted two sets of audits, unpersonalized one and then the personalized audits. The personalized audits goal was to assess whether users' account history built progressively by a user performing certain actions, such as clicking on a product, adding the product to the cart, showing their intention to buy. Does any of those actions, how does that change what recommendation is being returned? And here the user built these account history progressively by performing a particular action for 7 consecutive days. So these were, again, when I say users, these were sock puppets, searching plus clicking plus adding the product to the cart. So all these were different actions that were performed. And then we also controlled for noise, very similar setup as before, just with the caveat that this whole audit experiment setup was a big software engineering feat, considering the amount of different combinations of recommendations possible on Amazon. So what did we find? So I'm going to highlight a couple of results here. First, a single case study result. So let's say a user starts searching for a vaccine, and they click on an anti-vaccine book. So as of this morning, this book was actually there on their platform in the first search result page. And so if the user clicks on this, that algorithm next serves the user 3 other anti-vaccine books in the product recommendation page. And then once the user adds a product or book to the cart that shows their intention to buy, both the pre-purchase as well as the homepage recommendation also rapidly changes with many more anti-vaccine book recommendations. So this just tells you that once a user starts engaging with one misinformative product on this e-commerce platform, they will be presented with more of those similar stuff at every point of their Amazon navigation route. So this was not just a one-off case study. We found that more than 10% of Amazon products during the time period of our study for search terms like vaccine, autism, immunization resulted in misinformative book containing anti-vaccination content. And so our audit experiment, just to give you the scale of this experiment, this was ran for a little bit over 3 weeks, resulted in 36,000 search results, 16,000 recommendations, and then worked over several search filters like featured, sponsored, different recommendation types, user actions, and so all of that resulted in that number of more than 10%. So if you just zoom out and look at what these thousands of recommendations look like, this is the entire recommendation graph for one type of recommendation. What other items customers buy after viewing this item? So here, each node in the graph represents a product, an Amazon product, and an edge from a node A to a node B indicates that B was recommended in the product page of A. Node size here is proportional to the number of times the product was recommended, and the color corresponds to whether, if it's a red, if it denotes a product annotated as misinformative, green, neutral, and then blue, debunking. And I think being, all of you have CS degrees, so are almost about to get a CS degree, so you would probably able to decipher what's going on in this graph. There are these large red size nodes attached to other red nodes, which are almost completely separated. There are like 2 separate components, right? So this just shows how strong of a filter bubble effect there is for this particular recommendation. People who are recommended misinformative products, they keep getting recommended those products. Super hard for them to break out from that red zone to get to the blue or the green zone.
Sorry, just a clarification. I think you mentioned this, but how did you code something as misinformative or not? Like, obviously, there's lots of shades of gray here.
Yes. So there was an initial say we went through an extensive annotation scheme of a set of, and then we also built a classifier to do that. But the entire there were like a lot more details in the paper as to how we coded it, but I think it took us almost a month to even come up with the whole annotation scheme, and then 5 or 6 of our experts, including me, we kind of coded it. But yes, so we looked at a few markers like the name of the book, the text, read the Google preview of the text of the book, some of the comments, and then also the reviews that are present on the Amazon website. So it's a lot more qualitative process, and then all the markers that we took, we also put it into the classifier to get the final annotations.
So this would have been more like the overall position of the book, not like,
right.
Oh, was there a fact somewhere in there?
Yeah. So yes, we cannot really go and look at, okay, there is this one single line in the text in the book which is misinformative. No, but yes. So there you could say there's a little bit of noise in there. And so this was another one, just to say that this was not happening for one recommendation. Customers who viewed this item also viewed. Very similar graph as before, very similar trend. And so the key takeaway here was our goal was to bring the focus to e-commerce platforms and show how their algorithms could be pushing anti-vaccine content to users. And we empirically established how certain real-world user actions on the platform could drive users to these problematic echo chambers. I think one of the implications, at least from this work, is that recommendation algorithms should not be blindly applied to all topics equally. If it's a health topic, perhaps companies need to pay a little bit more attention and to ensure that there is higher quality content coming out of in their platform. So this work of ours, intentionally or unintentionally, was kind of rightly timed during the COVID pandemic. And so this was widely covered by several news channels. And in fact, Congressman Adam Schiff and Elizabeth Warren actually cited this research of ours in their letter to Amazon to control vaccine misinformation. So we were really happy that, okay, so now Amazon is going to take a few steps to do this, but turns out we were really wrong. So this is how Amazon is doing today. Still today, as of earlier this morning, you would still find several books containing vaccine misinformation. This also just tells like how, even though you go into all these lengths doing these academic research, is it actually informing policy? Is it actually making any real world impact? And we can go into a long discussion about that. But in the interest of time, let me talk a little bit more on one other type of study that we did, looking at another type of audit method. So far, the studies that I presented employed one type of audit method, sock puppet audits. While these audits provide great control over your experimental design, you can pinpoint exactly which variable might be affecting the output of the algorithm. But one criticism of these audits is that the bot's behavior are usually built in a very conservative way, right? So the bot in this YouTube case was essentially going and watching all pro-conspiracy videos or all debunking videos. Real users do not really act exactly that way, right? So these are these very extreme bot behaviors or user behaviors. So as an alternative, we conducted crowdsourced audits where we audited the algorithmic outputs from real-world users to study and identify problematic behavior in users' naturalistic setting. So we conducted this audit for a 9-day duration on YouTube, and our goal was to assess to the extent in which YouTube was regulating US-based election misinformation on their platform. And so soon after the presidential election in 2020, YouTube came under fire for surfacing election-related misinformation in their search and recommendations. And they quickly responded to those criticisms by introducing these content moderation policies to remove videos that spread election-related falsehoods and claimed that misinformative videos would not be surfaced on their platform. But then again, during the midterm 2020 elections, there were reports saying that YouTube still has misinformation blind spots, right? So they have not been very effective. So this study of ours goal was to determine how effective YouTube was in successfully implementing its content moderation policy. And so we did this through this post hoc crowdsourced audit. Why it's post hoc? Because it's conducted after the fact the event has happened, the elections of 2020, and we were conducting this study in 2022. And it's crowdsourced audit since we investigate YouTube's algorithm collecting data from real-world users. And I'm sure many of you who have run these sorts of recruitment studies, you would realize how difficult and how hard it is to do that. Essentially, we were asking users to lend their YouTube history so that we can do this sort of audit run. And so our crowdsourced investigation, I think we started with recruiting 600 to 500 users, and we ended up slightly lower than 100 users, so 99 particularly. So all these 99 users first filled out a pre-survey and about their beliefs on personalization on YouTube, how they trust YouTube search and recommendation algorithms, and then they installed this browser extension, which allowed us to collect users' personalized data. We also had all these ethical considerations, which I can go on into more detail if anyone is interested. But what this extension was doing, it was collecting search results of search queries related to the 2020 US presidential election, as well as voter fraud claims surrounding the 2020 elections. So two kinds of collection was happening. One was with respect to search results in the standard and incognito window. And by comparing these search results in both these windows, our goal was to tell the extent in which YouTube was personalizing search results. And then we were also collecting recommendation results. And the way we were doing this, we were collecting these up-next recommendation trails after a user has watched a list of pre-selected videos with different stances on election misinformation. And the extension would start by first watching a pre-selected seed video and then collecting up next videos up to 5 different levels. So when we asked our participants in this pre-study survey, how much do you think YouTube personalizes your search results? About 34% of them believe that YouTube personalizes their search results to a really great extent. But this, through our audit, we found that YouTube actually, their YouTube's top search results have little to no personalization. So this also tells you how users' belief in algorithms, like the way they behave, is different from actually the way the platform might be behaving. But when we asked how much YouTube personalizes their up next recommendation, that perception actually aligned with how actually the audit results showed. Like 51% of participants believe that YouTube personalizes up next recommendation to a great extent, which is in line with what our audit results found. We also calculated the amount of misinformation present in search results, and we quantified this with this misinformation bias score. And this is the only equation you're going to see throughout this talk. So this misinformation bias score varies from -1 to 1. What the score does is it captures the amount of misinformation, election-related misinformation, while taking into account the ranking of the search results. So a positive score indicates that search results contain videos that support election misinformation, while negative, it contains videos that oppose election misinformation. Now, if you look at the entire distribution of scores for our collected results, we found that the misinformation score, if you look at the x-axis, it's mostly negative, which indicates that YouTube presents more debunking or opposing videos in the search results. A couple of other key things also jumps off, right? So you could see this distribution is bimodal. So essentially there are 2 different clusters, and each of these clusters corresponds to 2 types of search queries. I mean, we didn't cluster it ahead of time, right? This emerged from our data. So the first cluster corresponds to voter fraud, basically anything related to fraud in conjunction with keywords related to election, while cluster 2 is more generic election-related searches, presidential election, mail-in ballots, and so on. What's interesting here is that the cluster 1 has these misinformation bias score, which are more negative, which indicates that if the user goes and search for fraud-related topics, they are actually going to be given more opposing election-related misinformation video, right? So YouTube is making it really difficult for users to search for election fraud video. Which in some sense tells that YouTube's pay more attention to queries about election fraud and ensures that when users are searching for them, they are in fact being exposed to opposing misinformation videos. So key takeaway here is, in some way, YouTube is in fact successful in enacting election misinformation policies. So things that we wanted to test, turns out it's actually aligning with how they wanted to enforce these policies, but it is indeed paying special attention to certain queries about voter fraud. But there still exists certain misinformation in the up next trails. We found that with some of those positive scores that you found. And then finally, as a byproduct of this audit, we also found that there was some mismatch in participants' beliefs and the algorithmic reality that happens, right? Which indicates some lack of awareness of algorithmic, how algorithms behave. And I think there has been other researchers who have been working in this space, looking at algorithmic folk theories and how people's perception differ from the way these platforms work. Now, wrapping up, so these all the other, the core studies that I wanted to present, but obviously coming back to how I started the talk, where do we go from here, right? How do we do meaningful algorithmic governance in the first place? That is, how do we set the path towards algorithmic governance in a meaningful way, and what are the challenges in doing that? So here are a few ideas, and obviously this is not there might be more that could be added, but these are some of the possibilities for doing algorithmic governance. So I've listed 3 of these. The first is algorithmic audits, and so governance via audits, and there could be many layers to this, right? So one of the layers is conducting external audits, and I presented some of these external audits studies through the 3 research work that we have done in the past. And also these audits could identify different types of risks. So misinformation is one risk, but you could also do the same for bias, discrimination, accountability, accessibility, fairness, and so on. And there are many researchers who have worked in this space. I've listed some of these citations here. But obviously, our question is, so we as academic community, third-party researchers, we are doing all these audits. Is it really making any difference, right? And classic example is the failure of our Amazon study to make much of a difference, right? So we still really don't have a system in place where the algorithms or companies running them are truly accountable to an independent third party. So this reminds me how US-based consumer reports operate, right? So there are these independent third-party organizations that go into great lengths for testing products that you use every day, your cars, your washing machine, and so on. So my argument is that why can't we do the same for algorithm? In fact, I would argue that we need that more for algorithms because we are using them much more frequently than, say, your washing machine. The other shortcoming with external audit is that they're a form of reactive governance. This was the question that Michael was asking even earlier. Like, they operate after the algorithm have been deployed, so after the harm has been done. Plus, the external auditors do not really have access to the models, to the training data, which are obviously protected as trade secrets. So as an alternative, another layer to governance via audits is you could do internal audits as proactive governance. And so at the time, researchers from Google, who are no longer at Google right now, but they released this paper making a case for internal audits, where audit would be a core part of product development at every step of the way. You could also do the best of both worlds, right? So you could do something called cooperative audits, which is a fairly newer concept where while external audits answers what problems the platform has and internal audit says why that's happening, you could have a combination of both, and you could do cooperative audits as shared governance, which allows external algorithm auditors to audit the system of willing private companies. So I've done a little bit of this with Spotify, where working with their engineers within the company, figuring out how gender representations might be biased or not for their taste onboarding and listen action on podcasts. And then finally, you also need to do these audits multiple times, right, longitudinally. That is, we need to conduct these continuous audits, monitoring platforms multiple times instead of that single snapshot audit. Many of my studies that I presented today are all single snapshot, and we do need that kind of longitudinal effort. So here is where I want to highlight one of the quotes from Debraji's earlier internal audit paper, where they mentioned the audit process is necessarily boring, it is slow, it is meticulous and methodical, which stands in stark contrast to what I had started my earlier slides with: move fast and break things, done is better than perfect. So very much in contrast with the rushed culture of technology development. And this is where I want to take a little bit of tangent and mention about audit possibilities. One of the fastest growing developing AI technologies is the large language models. And what would auditing even look like for large language models? What's the blueprint for LLM auditing? And then also, what are the key challenges, right? So one of the key challenges that is it's difficult to assess the risks that AI systems and large language models in particular pose independent of the context in which they are deployed. So we do need application-specific audits for large language models. The second challenge is that, and I don't know how to solve this, or rather even the first one, is that the capabilities and the training processes of these foundational models have really outpaced the development of the tools and techniques and the procedures for auditing, right? So it's really hard to keep up the pace. And so doing ethical, legal, and technically robust audits makes it super challenging for such a rapidly developing technology. And so that it must be complemented probably with much more newer forms of supervision and control. So here is one possible framework, one possible blueprint for auditing large language models, which is kind of 3 layers. So the first one is a model audit. So as the name suggests, it focuses on assessing the technical properties of the pre-trained language models. So this is very similar flavor to the internal audit that I mentioned earlier. So that's sort of proactive governance before you deploy the model. But then there is the application audit, which focuses on assessing the applications built on top of the LLMs. So which is these flavors of post hoc audit, right? And it should be done longitudinally, right? Multiple times over a long period of time so as to capture any sort of new properties that might be emerging. And then finally, I think this is the new form of audit that we haven't talked about a lot, at least the research community. These are these governance audits, that is assessing the processes whereby these language models are designed and where they are disseminated, so very much process-oriented, right? My next proposition is about value-centered audits. That is, there's this active conversation around social values, emphasizing while designing algorithms. And I think we also need to turn that attention and thinking into how we can value and respect humans involved in the audit process. So these humans could be in the form of users who use the system or even auditors who are investigating the sites. And so for auditors, if we bring back the conversation for a second back to misinformation, one instance where auditors did not really perceive fair treatment was this scenario where fact checkers are one of the key auditors of misinformation on online platforms like Facebook, Twitter. So the fact-checking organization Snopes a couple of years ago actually backed out of their partnership with Facebook because they didn't feel their values were being respected. I think to delve into this question of fair treatment of auditors, we need more effort. And so one way in which my group has started a few initiatives, we have launched a research endeavor with the fact-checking organization based in Kenya called PesaCheck. And this has also expanded to 16 other fact-checking organizations across 4 different continents. And we released our first report called the Human and Technological Infrastructures of Fact-Checking. And so one big motivation for this work is also this question of, are we really taking into account diverse voices when we are talking about governance and governing technologies? And are we really doing culturally responsible AI? Finally, how do we ensure actionable audits? That is, audits that result in real change. So one of the most successful examples of an actionable audit is Joy Buluami's gender shade study. What she did was she audited facial recognition algorithms, and within 7 months of the release of these original audit, all the 3 companies who had their facial recognition apps released new API versions that reduced accuracy disparities with gender, male and female, as well as race, darker and lighter skinned subgroups. So in other words, the gender shade study is a classic example of commercial actual impact. And so they laid out their approach in this actionable auditing paper of theirs. Highly recommend you all to go and refer to it. But turns out actionable auditing is often tremendously difficult to achieve. And here is where I want to revisit that earlier slide for our Amazon study to highlight how much we had failed in doing the actionable auditing. Right? So despite widespread media coverage, despite a letter from Congressman Adam Schiff, Amazon did not really act much. All they did was add that banner of COVID-19 information directing to CDC's webpage. So hopefully, this kind of summarizes the challenges as well as the opportunities in setting the path for algorithmic governance, and hoping with the new regulations coming in place, maybe if I were to give this talk next year, I would have a little bit more hopeful slide than how I'm ending this talk. So that's it. So this is all I talked about today. Most of this work was done with my then PhD student Prerna Juneja, who is now a faculty at Seattle University. And then my group, I would also stick in 3 other threads of work, which I obviously don't have time to talk about. But these are like a couple of other amazing students. So Shruti Farke, she did a bunch of work on computational social science. I was earlier meeting a student who was doing this sort of work. So things like big data analysis of online interactions, studying trajectories of participation of users in extreme communities, conspiratorial communities. We have also done a little bit of design intervention and social system design work with another student who is also a faculty now. This is more of an HCI flavor, where essentially questions like, how do you design a system to nudge users towards meaningful credibility assessment? How do you design a system to allow users to break out of their filter bubble, something called OtherTube that we built on YouTube? And then finally, the last and the least fleshed out thread is some of the work that is currently ongoing with 2 of my students. We are looking at challenges and opportunities of generative AI in fact-checking work. And then what are some cultural misalignment that might happen with language models, especially with roots in the global south. We are looking at cultural implications of these language models in countries like India and other countries in Southeast Asia. So with that, I would like to end and happy to take questions. Thank you all.
All right, we've got time for some questions.
Yeah.
I was wondering, in your auditing of YouTube algorithms that you guys looked at, well, I guess it was in 2020, so I wasn't sure if YouTube Shorts had been implemented since then, because YouTube Shorts are somewhat of a newer aspect. But I wonder if the algorithms that underlie the, I guess, traditional YouTube recommendation system underlie the same sort of like YouTube Shorts recommendation, because I guess the length of content and sort of the amount of stimulus that would be needed to get the person to keep on scrolling would be different, and therefore possibly seeing that if there are sort of similar patterns between the two, whether or not the density, I guess, of sort of misinformation sort of increases because of the fact the content is more short form.
Yeah. So for the first study, we didn't, at that time, shorts were not there. But then for the third one that I presented with election misinformation, we did capture YouTube shots. And that tells me that we should probably do another analysis comparing the length of the videos and whether it's a short video versus a long form. We did not do that, but that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Another question on the YouTube study, specifically the first one. Did you look at all at like the probability that you would get recommended legitimately false conspiracy videos, like on the moon landing, from videos about conspiracies that are a little bit more true, like missing persons cases that the police just don't investigate, and like the likelihood that you'll get recommended actually false content?
Yeah, we did not, because I think one of the shortcomings of running audits is the whole setup itself. So we have to start somewhere, right? So our starting point were a set of seed queries, right? So with the way you are framing it, we could the hypothesis could be, does a missing persons case lead you to more conspiratory videos? And in that scenario, I think we can use our audit framework to have those as seed queries and see what happens. There were a few words.
On your kind of concluding point about actionable audits, I'm just curious, do you think it's something to do with like the conducting of the audit itself, or just the context and how it aligns with like the company's incentives? Because it feels like the gender shades case, it was like a very easily framed as like poor performance, and so they were trying to cover themselves. Whereas Amazon is somewhat incentivized to keep people buying things even if those things are harmful. So like, I guess I'm wondering, like, do you think audits need to be conducted differently, or there just needs to be more external pressure, like from the government or the public, to incentivize the companies when they aren't, like, internally incentivized?
Yeah, I would think it's the latter. I think Joy went on to great extent to, after the study was published, to kind of give talks and publicize and do that kind of outreach, which I did not do with this work. I think that matters a lot, right? She's the one who went to congressional testimony and testified against these companies. And when you do that kind of impact, it would definitely translate, or there's a higher chance for your work to be translated to actual actionable outcome. I don't think those are actually steps listed in the actionable auditing paper. And in some sense, I feel like maybe the academic community need to think about how to incentivize those additional work. We don't have those incentives in place, and partly I think we should look inward and blame ourselves that we don't have those incentives in place.
Related to this a bit, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts more. When being either proactive or reactive, do you think we should draw a distinction between conspiracy theories or misinformation that has potential for great harm versus those that maybe don't, right, to justify interventions that override individual autonomy or control the information space? Like, who is the moon landing conspiracy theory?
Can you say that last part?
Like the moon landing conspiracy presumably isn't hurting anyone, right? Should we take it down?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think for companies like Google, I know they have this your money or your life. They have a weird acronym, YM, YL or something, set of search guidelines. If it's if those search results or the pages that show up, if it's affecting monetarily, financially, health, or your life, then they're going to be more proactive and act on it. So you're right, like moon landing is probably not to that extent, versus if it's vaccine information that has direct life consequences, right? But obviously then there are all these other questions that when it's very well known that if you are drawn to one conspiracy, you're likely to get other conspiracy theories, right? So then what happens? Should those be at least to the extent that they maybe should be prioritized in the recommendations, if not completely removed from the platform? Yeah.
Oh, this is sort of another sort of idea that I had. Sort of looking at the idea of like, what I think is sort of interesting about like social media apps like YouTube is the whole aspect of the immediate being able to communicate with others like via the comment section of a YouTube channel. And I was wondering if there's a way to possibly, like, I'm not sure how present this is, or if this is even like a thing that is even like something that is able to be like looked into. But is there a possibility that the algorithm may almost be promoting you content not necessarily by what it's physically providing or like showing up them recommended, but showing other users who would most likely put other links to more, I guess, like extreme videos in the comments being like, oh, if you thought this was interesting, like look at this. And so that's not explicitly YouTube's algorithm showing you a video, it's showing that same video to someone else who has the ability to share a link to another YouTube video. That would be almost like pushing someone down like a pipeline of conspiracy theories.
So more like how the social recommendations, like you're sort of adding this collaborative social recommendation component to YouTube and seeing how that pushes.
Like if YouTube, like you could have the same effect, like in theory maybe the YouTube recommendation system could not explicitly push someone by recommending like more intense conspiracy theories, but if YouTube is recommending someone who's already like a very like entrenched conspiracy theorist and maybe someone who's on the edge, if YouTube recommends them both the same like starting out conspiracy theory video, then you can have the person who's like very entrenched in conspiracy theories commenting and suggesting things themselves that. And it's not that YouTube is explicitly recommending the original person, or the person who isn't like entrenched in conspiracy theory. It's that they put them essentially on the same, or they put them in the same environment in which they could communicate.
Yeah. So actually, my group, some of Shruti's work, we have done this in the context of Reddit, where what you're describing, those very entrenched conspiracy users, we term this as veteran users. And so they are one of the big drivers of bringing other people, like what we call joiners, into the community of conspiracy group. So I hope YouTube never does that, what you're suggesting, but that's a classic marker of how these social dynamics can actually bring people into these conspiratorial worldviews. And empirically, we have seen that. And there is also social science theory proving that that definitely happens. Yeah.
One challenge that I feel like our field faces with audits is, I guess what I would describe as the sense I get of frustration from folks at these companies who feel like the audits aren't well executed or are way out of date as soon as they're published. Mm-hmm. And you made this point that we have to be very methodical and often slow in doing this. And then you throw in the peer review pipeline that can slow things down further.
Yeah.
And by the time the thing comes out, I remember seeing an applied research, a researcher in a company who in principle would be more open to this kind of stuff, being like, our algorithm doesn't even work like that anymore. And so I'm wondering, so obviously you listed a bunch of possible, cooperative audits, longitudinal, internal, and so on. I'm curious, is there anything we can do to address that? Like, let's assume that we can't change the incentives of the companies, we can't change how quickly we do the audits.
Yeah.
Are we always gonna be vulnerable to this, like, oh yeah, that was yesterday's algorithm kind of critique?
Yeah, that's a really good point. In fact, I was at a workshop with other folks like Christo Wilson and a few others who are in this, have done audits for a very long time with people from Facebook and YouTube. And I think we came up with this exact same question. And I think the common thing that emerged was that I don't think academics should be or academic institutions should be the places to do these sorts of long-term audits. It's fine to kind of develop the methods and kind of say, okay, this one should pay attention, for example, to Amazon, or this is the method to do it. But then you need like separate third-party companies to continuously do these audits, right? So sort of like consumer reports. What's the equivalent of that for audits? And I think at CSCW, the closing keynote, Room was mentioning that kind of red teaming. I think their company or whichever NGO she's working with, they are doing something like that. I think, so academics with that peer review process, I don't think we should be responsible for doing those sorts of continuous audits because we are always going to play catch up with companies. Yeah. Oh,
One last, yeah.
At the end.
Do you have thoughts on like Twitter has implemented like community notes where people can just like anyone can just write under a post like that's not true or this is misleading or this person never said that, like just like user-based immediate type auditing, if you will? Like, do you have thoughts on that versus like companies long-term auditing, or like if you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We haven't looked at community notes, but I know some researchers have kind of looked and researched it. I don't have really any very smart thoughts as to, other than the usual advice that it's a good thing that one should do it, but with the caveat that if the community doesn't reflect the right view, or I wouldn't use the word right, but a credible view of what happens then, right? That's problematic. So.
I think that's time. So let's thank our speaker.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.